Rahim Malik Yawmiddin. Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. Ihdina as-siratal mustaqim. Siratal ladzina an'amta alayhim ghayril maghdubi alayhim waladdallin. Amin. Sadaqallahu al-azim. Let me first of all welcome all of you to this interactive session on US justice system, dynamics and practices. We have two very prominent Americans, one who has served in the US Congress for several times, and still she is very active, and the other who is very well known as far as the human rights movement is concerned. I welcome them here, and Ambassador Akram Zaki is chairing the session. You all know him very well. And Barrister Sadia Abbasi, who is also member of the IPS National Academic Council and who has also served in the Senate of Pakistan. She is going to moderate this program. And I'm glad that Dr.Fowzia Siddiqui is also here, who is basically the host of these two speakers here in Pakistan. So let me hand over the proceedings to moderator of the program, Barrister Sadia Abbasi.
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of IPS, I welcome Cynthia Mckinney and Sara Flounders to this session of the IPS. It is an honor and a privilege for us to welcome them here. We are also grateful to Dr. Fowzia Siddiqui for coming here today and being a part of today's session. It is very important that we get to hear her viewpoint on the issue of Dr.Aafia Siddiqui. With those words, I will request Mr. Akram Zaki to initiate the proceedings. Thank you.
Guests, on my right, Cynthia Mckinney has been in the Congress, US Congress, at least for 6 terms.
Yes.
And she has remarkable contribution in the field of human rights, the field of the right to know. When the governments conceal, she wants to expose them. She has been asking questions about the reality of 9/11 and about the assassination of Martin Luther King.
Yes.
As to who was responsible for it. And he has taken all the causes, even in the Middle East and Palestine. As she was first associated with the Democratic Party, and then gradually, knowing that the two-party system have a monopoly of denying the democratic rights of 6 or 7 or 20 other candidates who contest for presidency are never mentioned and never invited to the debates. She was one of the leading candidates for presidency on behalf of the Green Party in 2004? Eight. And very interestingly, I saw her the day she got the nomination of the Green Party. She was wearing red dress, which convinced me that she was a radical. Even as a Green Party member, it's a great honor and privilege to have us here. I have one privilege that I share with her. She is graduate, master's degree from Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. I got a degree from the same school in the year she was born. So I am honored to request her to be the first speaker.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador and Madam Barrister, and to all of you at the Institute of Policy Studies. We have in Washington, D.C., a similarly named organization, but it is the Institute for Policy Studies. So I'm hoping that I at least got that right. I would like to stress that throughout my remarks, the reason that I am here is because I am an activist for peace and for justice. And it is impossible for the United States to represent peace and justice when it treats a daughter of Pakistan as it has treated Dr.Aafia Siddiqui. So with that, I think I've been charged with trying to explain the U.S. justice system. Well, I come about my analysis because really of who I am and my background. So I'd like to share a little bit of that with you first. I am a child of the civil rights movement in the United States. I am a beneficiary of the civil rights movement in the United States. And I can sit here as a former member of Congress solely because of the struggle of people during that era who wanted only simply the United States Constitution to apply to them. They wanted the Bill of Rights to apply to them. They wanted the right to vote, and not only the right to vote, but the right to have representation. Because I am absolutely certain that even right here in Pakistan, people go to the polls and vote. But oftentimes, you also don't have representation. You elect representatives, but you don't have representation. And Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said that the struggle of the Negro was not only for the right to vote, but also to have something for which to vote. And that something for which to vote is representation. So that at the end of a political debate, we can see a little bit of our input in the output of the policy. That was why people died for the right to vote, not just so that they could go into a ballot box, but so that they could share in public policy making. So with that, I would like to perhaps explain why it is that I took the positions that I took and how I carried myself into the House of Representatives. I served on the House International Relations Committee because as a college student, I went to the University of Southern California, a Trojan, not a Bruin, and then after that went to the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. And I was really on track to become a part of the U.S. Diplomatic Corps. But I could not, in good conscience, do that as a black person because I watched what the policies were that were being carried out by my country against people who looked like me in other parts of the world. That there was a difference in the application of those values that the United States talked about. Democracy, peace, truth, justice, all of that. There was a difference. I carried with me a book that really transformed my outlook. And it was a book written by John Stockwell. The name of the book is In Search of Enemies. And John Stockwell was the very first CIA station chief who spelled out exactly how U.S. policy was promoted in Africa. He was the Angola station chief. And so he watched as the United States fought tooth and nail, fought the liberation aspirations of people on the African continent. The United States, he exposed that the United States practiced a game of destabilization. It practiced a game of fabricated wars. It created rebel groups that would challenge those people who had been democratically elected. And of course, we know the sad interventions of the United States in those heady days when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., actually on the night before he was murdered, when he proclaimed that he had been to the mountaintop, he also said, "I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." Now, what exactly was he talking about? I'm not fearing any man. The sad fact of the matter is that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was targeted. He was targeted for assassination. He was targeted and tracked and surveilled and trailed. Military intelligence was there in Memphis, Tennessee, when snipers' bullets cut Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. down. The operation was called Operation Lantern Spike. And you could say that on April 4th, 1968, when Dr. King was murdered, a lantern of truth, a lantern of hope, a lantern for justice was spiked. All of this is available. It's public record now. You can look it up. I hope you take good notes. Before Dr. King, it was Malcolm X. And I had the opportunity to have my own personal Malcolm X moment when I visited Saudi Arabia during the time of Hajj. And I saw people from all over the world raising their praises to Allah. I saw people who looked like me. I saw women. I saw men. I saw every ethnicity, every race, every language, every accent on this planet. And for me, it was really the only way I could understand the transformation of Malcolm X, which is a big thing for people, particularly black people in the United States, the legacy of Malcolm X. So I learned a little bit about the universality of Islam, something that I had not known, really been able to feel before. But Malcolm X, too, was cut down by assassins' bullets. Malcolm X should have been a mayor, a member of Congress, a leader extraordinaire for all people. But Malcolm X was killed. And according to Jim DiEugenio, who wrote the book, The Assassinations, and he goes into the assassinations of JFK, RFK, MLK, JFK, John F. Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King Jr. On the day that Malcolm was supposed to go to the Audubon Ballroom for a speaking engagement, Malcolm received a call. And the call, he would receive these calls all the time, was from the FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation of the United States government. And the other end of the call, the voice said, "Today is the day." Now, any average, ordinary man might have said, "Darling, pack up the kids, let's get out of this country." Or, "Pack up the kids and let's go back to Georgia." But Malcolm said, "Darling, pack up the kids. I want them there with me." And so Malcolm kept his appointment at the Audubon Ballroom. And then, of course, we all know that Malcolm was killed at the Audubon Ballroom. And so all of that hope was dissipated at that moment. From Malcolm to Martin. And I can tell you one more, and that is about Bobby Kennedy. And Bobby Kennedy is important because Bobby Kennedy was on his way to become the President of the United States in 1968. He was going to be elected. But assassins' bullets shot him down too. In 1968, we lost both Martin and Bobby. The important thing to note is that Bobby Kennedy had put Martin Luther King Jr. on the short list to be his running mate. So the United States could have had as its leadership Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. But assassins' bullets stole that from the American people and from the global community. Now, what does that have to do with today? It has everything to do with today. I am in a PhD program now, I am studying leadership and change. And I know that you would agree that in the United States, as well as the global community, we need both leadership and change. We need leadership that is uncompromising on core values. We need to be able to count on the people whom we elect to keep their promises, to do the bidding of the people, and to provide that representation in policy. I've taught political science classes. There is a definition of politics, the authoritative allocation of values in a society. And the whole idea of representation is that sometime some of us can win a policy debate too. Increasingly, that is not the case. But in 1968, it was a very special moment in the United States where the anti-war movement, largely led by progressive whites, and we had also the independence movement of the Puerto Ricans. We had the Mexican-American pride movement of the Chicanos. We had the Native Americans pressing for their right to live in face of continued genocidal policies. We had the African American community pressing for its right to not have to live as second-class citizens. And they all came together and they worked together, and people power in the United States was real in 1968. You lost that, and I lost that, and I take it personally. And so I have dedicated my academic career now to not only understanding that moment, but also trying to fashion the narrative from that moment to now. I'm going to conclude in just a moment. And what I will say is that I'm writing a paper, and it will become the basis of my dissertation. But in the 1960s, there was a program called the Counterintelligence Program, COINTELPRO. It's available on the internet. You can look it up. And there you will see assassination attempts, use of the media to discredit people who only wanted the right to representation. You will see, as a result of the Church, Senator Frank Church did an investigation of intelligence activities inside the United States and abroad. And basically what they found is that the FBI and the CIA violated their own charters. They violated the rights of U.S. citizens. They violated U.S. law. They violated the U.S. Constitution. They violated international law. And this was from the 1960s. So now what do you think such a government is capable of doing in the 21st century? And I will leave it to my sister colleague, Sara Flounders, to tell you the rest of the story. But I hope I've at least fertilized the ground a little bit so that we can have a very fruitful and animated conversation after Sara's intervention. Thank you very much.
I don't know what's wrong with this. Acha, green. What a forthright presentation of the ugly realities of security agencies and how the will of the people, the genuine movements that were emerging in the late 60s were not allowed to reach their logical conclusion. I'll say something about it later. In 68, there was also a movement in our country on similar lines, and the man who led that movement, a few years later, was also hanged on the 4th of April, 11 years later. But this is a coincidence. And now I request our other distinguished guest, Sara Flounders, who has devoted her life to human rights causes and especially focused on Aafia Siddiqui's case. Her sister is also with us, so she's going to make a presentation of telling us that if before going to the courts injustice has been exposed, she's going to expose the injustice in the court system.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you to the IPS for having us here today for this discussion. My purpose in coming to Pakistan in this delegation with Cynthia Mckinney is really solely for raising up the case of Dr.Aafia Siddiqui. And this is an important issue in so many levels, in so many ways, because it's one case that has really come to personalize, in the deepest sense, U.S.-Pakistani relations. And I think everyone here knows that, feels it from the response in the street and from the millions who've spoken out for the return of Dr.Aafia Siddiqui, and who wonders with sheer frustration and growing rage how she happens to be in a prison under especially such brutal conditions, isolation, a form of torture recognized as such in international law. They wonder, how could this be? And isn't this an insult to every Pakistani? So my purpose in being here is very much that. Let me just set this timer so I don't speak too long. But I was very moved by Cynthia Mckinney beginning with discussion of 1968, because actually, you could say that's when I came into political life and political activity, opposing a U.S. war in Vietnam, very much a part of and identified with the civil rights movement and all the aspirations of that period. And looking at it 45 years later, the U.S. empire, what it could do then and what it's capable of now, is dramatically different. They're the weapons that can fire a drone halfway around the world, and the programmer can then go home for lunch. 3,000 Pakistani civilians killed. in what are now daily drone attacks. And yet, U.S. policy is less able to impose their will on any country around the world. And what's happened in Afghanistan is the clearest example. By every measure, the poorest country in the world, and poorer since U.S. intervention, and yet a complete failure, a collapse, and a disaster of U.S. policy. And there's every soldier based in Afghanistan knows that there's no trust with any of the Afghan soldiers they're working with, for good cause, because they've brought and done nothing except to create a further disaster. Now, when you look at the drone policy, that impersonalized killing of civilians, violation of international law, an attack on the sovereignty of every country, but especially of Pakistan, but the whole idea that you can just fire a missile, decide who you'll kill, collateral damage, it's irrelevant. A completely criminal policy. So let's look at the drone attacks where so many civilians, innocent civilians, are killed, and look at the policies of secret rendition and kidnapping, which caught up Aafia Siddiqui. Completely innocently. You could say an innocent civilian caught up just as the innocent civilians are caught up today in Pakistan in a drone attack. This was a U.S. policy of 10 years ago. Anyone who was considered a threat, grab them up, secret prisons, all over, not just Guantanamo or Bagram. People sent halfway around the world to be tortured and interrogated. And it's quite phenomenal and incredible. The U.S. administration arguing that waterboarding isn't torture. You can't read this without knowing the impact it has, even within the U.S., from those who formerly thought in every way they could support U.S. policies around the world. And it has become untenable on many, many levels. Now, on Aafia Siddiqui's case, many people have asked here how such a thing is possible in the U.S. Don't people know about this? Don't they care? The case is almost unknown in the U.S. That is a fact. That's the role of the media. It's also important to know that Dr.Aafia Siddiqui is one of more than 800 Muslim political prisoners held in special units now, serving decades in U.S. prisons. There are entire prisons called SHU, special housing units, where prisoners are held in total isolation, sensory deprivation. Could such a prison system exist in the U.S.? And yet, the average person in the U.S. doesn't know this. It's a war policy that continues out of sight of the U.S. population, where in poll after poll, 80% of the population is now against another U.S. war. And yet they don't know about the very wars going on right now, and they don't know about those who are part of that war who are held in U.S. prisons. Now, I attended Dr. Aafia Siddiqui's trial, was part of organizing support that there should at least be people with a sign in front of that courthouse, or those who went in as witness. And here was a trial where there were no facts. It was prohibited to discuss where Aafia Siddiqui had been for 5 years before this shooting. The court could only deal with what happened in 300 square feet in 5 minutes' time. There was no evidence, though, even on those 5 minutes. There was no one injured, with the exception of Dr.Aafia Siddiqui. There were no fingerprints, there were no bullets, as I say, and no injuries. And yet, this trial proceeded, and the sentence, 86 years. It's beyond the capacity to even picture for a crime that had no victim. And yet the news coverage in New York was both so routine and so demonizing that we're asked to accept that this, I won't even go into all the media stories at the time, except to say that they were beyond fantasy, beyond James Bond. There's a coalition in the US, the National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedoms, which is just the work of cataloging who were the lawyers, what were the charges, what went on at the trial, and where are the families now for the 800 that are known Muslim prisoners that are part of those swept up with each of them charges and trials that are so outrageous that it's not possible to believe. But that's not the point of demonization. The role of demonization is to justify war on terror and the necessity to create a new terrorist threat every week in some little city or town in the US. And facts are really quite irrelevant. Now, the difficulty, whether it's the drone attacks, the kidnapping, the secret rendition, the torture of Dr.Aafia Siddiqui, or any of the others who were held, this is really all an attack on the sovereignty, the dignity, the pride of Pakistan, who thought the US government was an ally, a partner. And you'd have to ask, what kind of partnership is this? Instead, US involvement in this region has led to a much lower rate of development, a far greater rate of poverty. And it has an impact at home. There was a famous quote from Dr. Martin Luther King during the Vietnam War that said, "The bombs that fall in Vietnam fall on American cities." Now that was so true then, at a time when we were assured guns and butter was possible. But it's really true 40 years later, that there's no longer the money. The money for US wars are being stolen from Social Security and health care and pensions and housing, and especially from education. The US it ranks about 24th on the world scale, below every other industrialized country in health care and in education, and all sorts of basic standards, and sinking every day. Now, there was a flood in Pakistan 2 years ago, impacted whole parts of the country. The most basic infrastructure could have prevented a great deal of the damage. You had one of the most high-tech wars, enormous amounts of equipment, satellites that could measure, and they could tell well in advance exactly where the water was going and what it would be doing. But there was no infrastructure. I think all too often in New York City we feel, well, that's happening in Pakistan. We just came through last month Hurricane Sandy. One hurricane, storm, some high water, Wall Street was up and running in 2 days. Whole parts of the city were weeks without power. I don't know if you can picture being on the 20th or 30th floor of a high-rise without pumped water, without a flush toilet, without any running water. You're bringing it up in, in jugs, without heat. You think you've gone back 100 years. And yet, this is the infrastructure in New York City. You had whole housing complexes, 400 generators right there in New York City. FEMA had actually delivered them. And yet, any one of them capable of powering an entire housing complex, government building, hospital, none of them put in place. We had 6 hospitals where, major hospitals, where not only did the electricity go out, but the backup generators failed. Aged people, people with all kinds of immune problems being evacuated in the middle of the night in the wind and the rain, papers lost. And I really, when I read an article of a woman who spent 2 weeks trying to locate her 92-year-old grandmother, blind, somewhat senile, lost in the storm, evacuated from a hospital and dumped in a high school gymnasium. 2 weeks, couldn't be found. And I thought, gee, and a drone could find someone on the other side of the world, read a license plate, and yet a grandmother can go missing right in New York City in a hospital bed where her whole family knew she was there. So this is what the wars are costing. This is what the wars are costing in the US and costing here. A complete destruction in planetary terms. And if we want to talk about global planetary terms, just to raise who's the biggest polluter on the planet today is the Pentagon. US weapons and the aircraft carriers, it's actually kept out of all of the carbon measurements within agreements and Kyoto Accords. But the impact we feel, and it's felt here, it's felt in New York City, it's felt in the US. Now, just because I want to keep going back to Dr.Aafia Siddiqui. Here's a woman who's training. Her paper, she specialized in education and cognitive neuroscience. Her paper, her PhD thesis, was in learning through imitation to improve children's education. Shouldn't she be back here in Pakistan with a specialty like that? In a country where 1/3 of women are illiterate. And instead, US policy is that she's held in solitary confinement in a trial where there was daily torture, strip searches. Picture what her injuries were and how excruciating that was. The remedy for Dr. Siddiqui couldn't be simpler. She should be returned. There's no legal appeals left. Just on a humanitarian basis. Wouldn't that be simple? We're here to raise a pledge that we're asking Pakistani politicians to make, that no one in Pakistan's custody should be returned to the US, not a Raymond Davis, an Afridi, or anyone else, until Aafia Siddiqui comes home. Isn't that simple? Reasonable? There are many ways that problems can be solved if there's a will to. The problem is today, unless there's a powerful mass movement, there's not a will to solve these problems. And it needs to be heard loud and clear. Now, I want to say something else about the US prison system, US injustice system. You can't call it justice system. The largest prison population in the world today is right within the borders of the U.S. 2.3 million people in prison. It's about 10 times the size of the prison population of any other industrialized country. More prisoners in California than in Western Europe. The rates are staggering. The rates on children in prison. The number of people on death row. The conditions in the prisons. There's 7.5 million who are on probation, parole, all kinds of extended forms of imprisonment. And this doesn't count the children in reform schools, and it doesn't account for the immigrants facing deportation. It doesn't necessarily count for county jails. It's a huge part of the population, overwhelmingly people of color, and that's the impact of racism that impacts everything, but particularly the prison system in the U.S. So it's a system of injustice where most of the people in prison have never had a trial, saw a lawyer for 2 minutes when they were being told how to plead, in a system they had no comprehension for. And if they're lucky, they'll plead to the charge and get time served, 6 months, a year while they were waiting, if they're lucky. So that's the prison system in the U.S. It has nothing to do with justice. It has nothing to do with reform or rehabilitation whatsoever. It's punishment in the most excruciating forms. And the release of anyone from such conditions should be a priority. And for those of us in the United States today, whether we're opposing U.S. wars or U.S. prisons, it's hard to see the difference, except to know that the one growth industry in the U.S. today is the building of prisons. Schools close everywhere. Hospitals, as I say, picture 6 hospitals where the electricity fails and the backup generators fail. It's mind-boggling. So this is part of the decline and decay of an empire that cannot spend endlessly for war, and yet it does. More than half of the federal budget is for war, for weapons, because it's a guaranteed source of profit. And you have a capitalist system that is in severe crisis. So guaranteed profits for weapons systems, that sells. Now, let me just end again on our sister, Dr.Aafia Siddiqui, because this is a woman who could contribute much. And will her life be wasted? Will her children be without their mother? And are there concrete steps that we can at least take for her immediate release, while at the same time knowing the most powerful industry that there is in the United States today is the media. That shapes the perception of what the United States is, what the conditions are, what the future means. Now, I actually find that always a reason for optimism, because we have a media that 24/7 sells war. So it's actually very exciting that 80% of the population is against another war. It means, on a certain level, a significant part of the population is no longer buying what the media is selling. Doesn't mean they have an alternative right now. Doesn't mean they feel empowered right now. Although that sense is also growing. I will tell you, it's very important what happened with the Occupy movement this past year in the US. More than 1,000 Occupies that grew up overnight in cities across the US. Every one of them shut down. Every one of them in complete violation of US law, everything confiscated. Huge number of arrests. We saw it reborn in the most exciting way in New York after the hurricane. Who were the youth who provided the emergency supplies that the Red Cross and FEMA and the federal government couldn't? It was hundreds of youth that came out. It grew into thousands and provided the emergency relief. It's a good sign that people's movements built from below may actually be a more powerful web of services and a challenge to the powers that be. And the powers that be need to take note of this in Washington and here in Islamabad, too. That the demands for people to be heard has more power today, is more immediately in communication. The very fact that so often Dr. Fowzia, Siddiqui, and I can communicate on the other side of the world through email, through videos, through websites, or that from the International Action Center we could put up a simple petition calling for the repatriation of Dr. Siddiqui, and it's gathered. It's sent out now more than 250,000 messages to US politicians, to Pakistani officials, saying repatriate Aafia Siddiqui. So people have more ways of communicating than they did before. 40 and 50 years ago, the average person on this planet didn't know what was happening in the village across the river. And that's no longer true. So there are big possibilities to communicate, to connect, to make changes, and to make real challenges. And one thing that would make a real impact here, I know I can feel this in a unifying sense, is the release, the return of Dr. Aafia Siddiqui. This would be a huge victory in Pakistan. It's possible. A few months ago, now this is Washington's policy, you never apologize, never apologize. It's unthinkable. Mistakes happen, don't apologize. It was Pakistan. It was the action of truck drivers that made Washington apologize. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton came here to do it personally, didn't she? That's an important lesson that the people of Pakistan have shown the whole world, that we can stand up for our sovereignty. We can actually do things that impact the war machine, war going on right next door in Afghanistan. We can make our voice heard. People around the world, I think, took note of that. And it's the impact that the release of one woman from a prison in Texas could have in Pakistan. We're very hopeful. We are. I have to say that we're hopeful from our visit. It's not because we're hopeful about US courts, but we're hopeful that even in Washington, the significance and the importance of this will be understood. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much for a very moving presentation of this injustice that is being practiced on an official level. And in the end, finally, your reference to the people's power which is emerging is the ray of hope. With this, I'd like to thank you for your presentation, and I hand over to our colleague, Senator, Barrister Saadia, to give everybody a chance to ask questions and make brief comments for this.
Thank you very much, Zaki Saab. We will open the floor to questions and answers. And I will request those who are asking questions to identify themselves for the benefit of our guests. We will start with opening remarks by Dr.Fowzia Siddiqui, and then we will start the question and answer session. Thank you very much.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you very much, Barrister Sadia Abbasi, Akram Zaki Saab, and all the faculty and participants of the IPS. Thank you very much for having us here. As you all know, that my honorable and respected guests here, they've been raising their voice in America for Aafia and for basic human rights. And when they came across Aafia's case, well, Sara informed me of a lot of things. She's a witness to the trial that I was not. Unfortunately, I was not allowed to go and attend that trial. Aafia was not allowed to have attorneys of her choice. The attorneys that were defending her had not even met with her. And yet the trial went on. And when Aafia requested attorneys of her choice, she was told that she's mentally unstable and unable to pick up the right people. If she's that unstable, how could she have stood trial, would be my question. And then what happened in the trial and the witness statements and all, Sara is witness to, and she informed me of a lot of things, but then what can I do? As you all know, and who have been following this is the 10th year now that she's going through all of that. Whereas anything that has been put on her has been disproved. Even the kidnapping, the person that kidnapped her has given a recorded statement that he kidnapped her and and everything. And those were in the handouts that you were supposed to have, and I don't know what happened to those handouts. They were given to the policy managers here. And you can look into them if they do appear at some point. But the question that I have here, and that I would open to that, is it's not just the U.S. that we would be lamenting. She was kidnapped from here. It was a time when one of our dictators actually, he wrote in his book that he is selling our own people. And I think that is when we lost our pride as a nation, when we sell our own brothers and sisters to a foreign master. And that, I think, is the biggest travesty, and I think that is what Aafia's case has unmasked us. And then what it has unmasked is the judicial system. That there are 800 Muslims locked up and unjustly incarcerated. No one even knows their names. Maybe Aafia's family with the education, and maybe God picked. You know, when in the old days of the sacrifices, when there was a time of human sacrifices, they would pick the purest to sacrifice before their Lord. Maybe, Aafia has been picked or chosen just because her case is so outrageous and she is so innocent, as Tina Foster had said, who did the investigation of the International Justice Network, and she investigated the whole case, and she said, the more I dig in, and oh my God, America could not have found a more innocent person. So maybe the reason for her case getting that hype is that she comes to personify all these victims. And with that, I think I'm going to leave you all with the respected guests. I'm here, and you can always ask me all the questions you want at any time. Thank you all again very much for having us here and for sparing the time. Right. Here are some more handouts if you would need. We can pass them on. Who want them? Like this pass.
Thank you, Fawzia. Now we will open.
California was mentioned twice. My question is specific to California and also to the US. Number one, what is the statistical probability of a black person going to jail in his lifetime? And a related question, I believe it costs $48,000 to maintain a prisoner in California per annum. It costs $25,000 to send someone to college, and 4 years of college ensure that he will never go to jail. People who go to jail are being on them is being spent $48,000 a year for years and years and years. There's a clear link up between the two. The investment in the education could preclude social disaster, and the costs of a justice system which a virtually bankrupt state of California cannot afford. And that is not the only bankrupt state. And as you mentioned, this is a growth industry. Are there any figures on what costs of the prison system in the US are? Thank you.
I think Sarah and I, Sarah probably more than me, can wax eloquently on this subject of the prisons. But we have Michelle Alexander, who has written a book entitled The New Jim Crow. And for those of you who are not familiar with Jim Crow was the way black people were treated after slavery. It was the moment of apartheid in the United States. And she puts forward the evidence to back her claim that the prison industrial complex in the United States than there were in 1850 prior to the Civil War. It's a staggering indictment on the fact that the United States is yet, notwithstanding the fact that you've got President Obama in the White House, carrying out the policies of the empire. But the United States is yet to effectively deal with the issue of race in the United States. The second point that I would like to make is that this new Jim Crow is a continuation of the way black people have been treated all along. And so you have activists from the 1960s, like Professor Angela Davis, who has written several books and started a mass organization against the prison industrial complex. She actually advocates the abolition of prison and restorative justice in the fashion of the indigenous people, the Native Americans, the way they treated people who committed offenses against the community. So you are right that the policy from an economic standpoint, of course, prisons are privatized, and so people are making profit off of the pain of others. But that economically, it doesn't make sense. But if you look at the underlying motives that do have race as a factor, then those policies of incarceration make a whole lot of sense.
Should I also address this, or we take other? a short point. When evaluating the cost of prisons or of war, there's a social cost that the people pay for, which is enormous, disastrous, but which a handful enormously profit from. That's true with the military industries, guaranteed profit, and it's true with the prison industries. The prisons genuinely are a new form of slave labor, and the largest corporations in the U.S. today are paying prisoners 23 cents an hour. You can't beat it. It's cheaper than any country anywhere in the world. And there are millions of people to employ that have no unions and no benefits and no set hours. 23 cents an hour. 25% of the prisoners in the world today are in the U.S. That's pretty enormous. And I'll give a little plug. I have a book that I've just come out with. It's my book. It's called War Without Victory, the Pentagon's Achilles heel. It's their failing point. This is what's going to bring them down. But at any rate, it was quoting Michelle Alexander and others who said 39% of black men today in their 20s are in prison, or on probation or parole. They're caught up in the prison system. 39%. It's huge. And the prison population has grown by 5 times in the last 30 years. That's a growth industry. A growth industry that is still growing. And I'm going to bring it back to Aafia Siddiqui, because as Fowzia Siddiqui reminded us, sometimes one person can come to personalize a policy, open up a discussion and a debate. And I think that's an important way of us taking this opportunity to look at what mass incarceration means today in the U.S.
I'd also just like to say that the presence of these prisoners in prisons across the United States, which has become a gulag, has nothing to do with criminal behavior. It has, and it's very important to note that we have one project, the Innocence Project, that's gotten over 200 people off of death row. They were sentenced to death and later found innocent because of DNA testing. So if the system, the organizers of the U.S. system the way it is, could treat U.S. citizens this way, then it's very easy for them to treat citizens of other countries this way. And that's what we have to keep in mind, that this kind of treatment accorded to U.S. citizens, some of us are not surprised that Sister Aafia could end up in the conditions that she's in, because we understand the full legacy of the United States.
Thank you very much. Because of shortage of time, we'll take 3 questions at a time, and then we'll take the response, because there might be overlapping questions. There's going to be no break for prayers, but those who wish to offer prayers, they may do so. So, Ambassador Saab, aap.
I'd like to thank I first would like to thank both the speakers for giving us a very insight information on the subject they are talking about. I have 2 points, one for the Congresswoman Cynthia. Outside America, the perception is that there is hardly any difference between Democrats and Republicans, except of nuance. So what is the hope for the Americans to get out of this position that they have got into? It is a corporate-controlled society in which elections are won by people backed by the corporations, and there seems to be no light at the end of the tunnel. And on the other, for the other speaker, Ms. Sara, could you tell us why the US justice system has gone so low? What are the basic weaknesses of this system? Because justice system is the only system in any civilized society that guards against the excesses of the executive. And here it appears that they are just towing the line of the executive. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you for educating us on how the violation of the United States law is going on right from 1960 onwards. And I do admire the tolerance of the American people. We share that with you. We tolerated here a dictator for which we are getting abused every day by sending our own nationals abroad. But we were faced with one individual, and finally we got another one individual who stood to him despite the might of the dictator, and not only shunted him out of the country, but is taking almost on daily basis suo motu actions against the government and has brought the government almost to a standstill. What is your justice system doing? Can't the justice system correct the system by taking a suo motu actions against them? I wish our borders were close by. Then we may have done something to have rescued our sister from America, but we are too far away. I remember that reminds me of the wishes of the Taliban leader way back in 1998, when President Clinton fired a missile on Osama bin Laden, and then he said that, I wish we had missiles to have recounted. But since we do not have, we cannot fight against the American in the aerial war. But we pray to Almighty that they make a mistake and step on the ground here in Afghanistan. And when Bush did it, I said how quickly his prayers are answered. And now that superpower, or rather the might of the world with the NATO and ISAF forces, is packing up, is almost on the run, without accepting that it is a defeat. It is a defeat, no doubt. For that, I would like to quote from Bob Woodward's book, where he has quoted General Jones, the security advisor to President Obama, where he has said many things else, but he said, if we do not succeed in the war on terror, he says, if we do not succeed here, organizations like NATO by association, the European Union, and the United Nations might be relegated to the dustbin of history. Do we send everybody to the dustbin of history, including your justice system also, if they have failed?
I'm a man from Fata, and we have got the scars. Raymond Davis was there and he killed 2. And once he was released and in Bagram landed, he was given a thunder salute by the drone by killing 48 elders of our tribes. So that's what is the justice system on the military side and on the CIA side. My question is that since not only the fingers but the tail of the US in Afghanistan is on the, you can say, inflagration and burning, And they are getting out, and they are asking us to release the prisoners once they were blacklisted. So could this could be bartered for Aafia so that she is also a prisoner of the war on terror? She can be released on the same swap over, and it could be made a condition. And what sort of movement there and here it could be initiated so that this thing also comes.
Thank you. आपको सवाल.
My name is Dr.Fowzia. I'm a writer and novelist. My question pretty much relates to questions that we've already heard. I was just curious about what the follow-up to the Frank Church investigation was, whether anyone was held to account, and what the challenges are in holding any official to account when found, responsible for violations of international and domestic law.
Thank you. We'll take your responses now. Thank you.
I'll take up first the question with how to gain possibilities for gaining the release of Dr.Aafia Siddiqui. Tina Foster, Aafia Siddiqui's lawyer, put forth a very interesting paper summing up the whole case, 3 ways in which Aafia could be returned: the adoption of a multilateral international prisoner transfer treaty, which would just take Pakistan signing, and someone convicted in a U.S. court could be returned here to serve their prison sentence or to be retried, or there are many possibilities, but certainly that would bring Aafia Siddiqui home. A bilateral agreement for an exchange of prisoners. U.S. has done this countless times over the years with enemies and with allies. Throughout the Cold War, it was common practice, but today, with Mexico, with Britain, with Canada, with Israel, with any number of countries, there are exchanges of prisoners. Direct diplomatic negotiations between the 2 governments. The U.S. ambassador here in Pakistan said that the problem, of course, he would put it here, but the Pakistani government has never asked formally in writing for the return of Aafia Siddiqui. So that's important. Pakistani government has to first ask, and that's an important step. And the Aafia movement has done a great deal to lay the groundwork for the government taking that step. And all the pressure that can be brought to bear from many different levels will make that a possibility. But this is a solvable problem for one woman. Now, the system itself and the justice system, and as I say, it's an injustice system. The U.S. is a country founded on slavery. Slavery was completely legal, enforced. An entire class, African people, had no rights. A white man was bound to respect in any way whatsoever. This is part of the Constitution, and it's the laws that continue to this day in so many ways. This is the heritage, it's part of the real history of the U.S., it's ingrained in every institution. But the justice system itself, and while you fight to change it, you got to recognize the disease that's in the system itself. How could it go so low? Part of it is also militarism gone wild, that ever greater levels of repression to solve every problem. It impacts domestically. As I say, 30 years' time, the prison population grown by 5 times. But the military budget has grown at almost the exact same rate. The weapons and the huge number of soldiers that come home, and what are the jobs that they get? They're not trained to be much of anything. So maybe prison guards or police. So the two things become more and more enmeshed. That's a solution at home, more repression. It's a solution abroad. It's the guaranteed profit source. And I think that's the real problem. And I'll just say, in terms of the Republicans and the Democrats, there is little difference, and that's the real problem we face. And Cynthia Mckinney, you know, there are lots of thousands of former Congress people. I think Cynthia Mckinney is perhaps maybe just about the only person that in Congress both voted against a military budget and refused to agree to what was called the AIPAC pledge, not to criticize Israel. That's why she wasn't a 7-term. Almost every year she was in Congress, they redrew her district. That's the problem that both political parties face, and that's corporate rule, the money it costs, and the way in which the redistricting can again and again. And if you're going to be honest in Congress, well, I don't know how you could be honest in Congress and stay in Congress. That's the dilemma.
I have the little things for the 4 questions, and then I have 6 things that I've jotted down that I want to get in our limited time. So the answer on the 2-party system in the United States. Interestingly, you will see in the church committee reports that people who were to be subjected to surveillance by the state were those who had no longer believed in the 2-party system. Those were the potential troublemakers who could upset the system, the U.S. system, the way it was and is still configured. Is there hope? As long as you've got people like Sara, people like Dr.Fowzia, people like Altaf, people who are in the Free Aafia movement, from what I have seen, and we've just been here a few days, yes, there is hope. As long as there is the spirit of resistance to injustice. Some people choose to participate in injustice. Some people choose to be bystanders. They'll just watch and allow it to happen. But Sara and I, and Fowzia and Altaf, we choose active resistance. I wake up every morning and I ask myself, what can I do to resist today? That's why I'm here, resisting injustice. And as long as we have people who do that, there's hope. Can the justice system be changed? Yes. When we finally arrive at a critical mass of people who are willing to turn their television sets off. I don't know if that is relevant here, but I did a bicycle ride across the United States. I went from Oakland, California to the house of, I can't even remember the name of the house where we started, to the White House. The idea was that in Oakland, California, that people had common sense. And in Washington, D.C., at the White House, they needed some common sense. And it was Bike for Peace. What I noticed was that the people who had the most independence of thought were the people who had learned to turn off CNN And then, of course, if you understand the rest of the story, that the CIA, you can go search this and find the story too, has its psychological operations agents in the CNN newsroom. But it's not just CNN, it's the rest of them as well. Let's see, what is this? Something for, what is that? What did I write? For Africa? Oh, no, for, oh, barter. Yeah, Sara answered that one. NATO, well, I thought, I was there in the House International Relations Committee when they voted to expand NATO. And I was waiting for the peace dividend because we had been promised the peace dividend. So I voted no on NATO expansion because NATO is an anachronism. North Atlantic Treaty Organization, what's it doing in Afghanistan? And follow up to the church committee reports, no, nobody is ever punished. Now, the 6 things that I've written down just briefly, the deep state. Professor Peter Dale Scott, Professor Emeritus now at the University of California at Berkeley, theorized the deep state. The things that I talked about, the things that are reported in the church committee reports, the things that have happened to Dr.Aafia, indicates the presence of a deep state. People who live, actually, Musharraf's book exposes that not only is there a deep state in the United States where things happen and the public don't know what their own government is doing, but that you've got a deep state here in Pakistan that needs to be uncovered. This may be a little bit heretical. And maybe I shouldn't say this because I might offend some sensibilities. And just take it as me, an outsider, who's just thinking off the top of her head about how we got into this mess. And what I put down here is Pakistani help in creating this blowback. Now, Pakistan was a U.S. partner in creating this, what is now called Islamic fundamentalism. And now it's this very existence of Islamic fundamentalism. I'm putting this in quotation marks, that's what that means, because I don't believe in that, but this is a creation. This is a religious creation that has become a political tool. And when that happens, then you can get victims like Dr.Aafia, because anyone who prays to Allah can find themselves underneath a drone. Now, I went to Libya when our president was bombing Libya. And I know that there's no such thing as a bomb that's not accompanied by war crimes. Who is the U.S. today? This is a question that I have thought about and what I would like the IPS to consider. Because when you say you have a partnership or a friendship with the United States, who exactly do you have a friendship with? Do you know your partner? And if you don't know your partner, you can get tricked and fooled by your partner, kind of like Petraeus, you know? Muazzam Beg. I participate in the Pradana Global Peace Foundation, the Kuala Lumpur War Crimes Commission, and I was present when Muazzam Beg gave his testimony, who is a Pakistani UK citizen. and he was in Pakistan, and he suffered a similar fate and ended up in Bagram and also in Guantanamo Bay. And his testimony was shocking because he said he heard the cries of a woman, and he knew from his cell, which was away, but he could hear those cries. And he said that woman, now he believes, was Dr.Aafia Siddiqui. Amazing. The United States, point number 5, is that war today is sociocide. Sociocide is the complete destruction of the entire society. So it's a different level of war, where it's ecocide, ethnocide, genocide, it's all of those sides. And so is Pakistan the victim of sociocide? And the question that I would ask for the United States is the United States a victim of socio-suicide? And then, of course, the legal situation in the United States after September 11th. We had the passage of the Patriot Act, the Secret Evidence Act, the funding for the war on terrorism. Now we've got the president signed the National Defense Authorization Act, which is the indefinite detention, and we've got an administration that says that it can execute targeted assassinations of U.S. citizens on U.S. soil. This is the legal, all of this is legal. Back in 1976, when the Church Committee made its reports public, Senator Church said that those activities were illegal and un-American, but they're legal now in the United States. We need those people who choose to resist, to lead lives of resistance, to stand for office, here and in the United States. And that's the way we can change.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We'll take the last 3 questions now, please. Thank you.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. My name is Yusuf Qureshi. I am also lived long time in my life in United States, citizen of United States, law graduate from the United States. And I heard a lot about the United States today. And I think I have to defend it a little bit to the United States. Lot of things have been said about the United States. And I will say if I would have not gone to the United States, I would not be like the liar over here and over there in the United States. Lot of things has given me to the United States has given to me. I came to this country, I established all the system over here. I learned it from the USA. Most of the time I spent in New York to practice of law in the United States, New York. We discuss here today, I opened law college over here too, and teaching United States law over here too. We discussed today a lot of things. I think I have to defend it a little bit to the defendant too. I see 2 things we discussed today here. One was the United States foreign policy, and the other was the United States inside the policy. I see inside the United States the system which has been built in the United States, which I spent almost about 14, 15, 16 years in the New York, USA, is excellent over there. I see the taxpayer system is very good too. Judicial system I see is good. The judicial system, especially which we like it over here, that the court system, which is a small claim courts, they have the district courts, they have the appellate courts, they have a surrogate court, especially for the women and children rights, so Supreme Court's there to listen. And this system which really improved the system in the United States too. If inside what is in the US, we see the behavior of the people, like the black people and the white people and their drugs, related issues over there, AIDS issues.
I object. I object. How dare you say black people and the use of drugs? When white people use drugs and blacks are the ones who are incarcerated. How dare you say that? Okay.
The black people and the white people over there, and also the AIDS over there, the drugs over there, the behavior of the people over there. The problem is over there, if the system, excuse me 1 minute please, let me
You're blaming the situation of black people on their own behavior. That sounds exactly, and I guess you would say that Sister Aafia is where she is because of her own behavior.
I am sorry if you mind that, I take my word there too. I say we are also a citizen of the United States. We are Asian too. We work there. We pay the taxes over there. And it's not something I say only especially for the black too. Indeed, you can see a lot of system, a lot of legal system over there. If it's not improved over there, it would be very bad for the USA too, because that would be, United States would be another Pakistan over here too, because of the system, if it's not improved over there, and the especially judicial system over there too. I see most of the problem which is created economically is, in the United States, the overcome of the Jewish economic system over there. All the businesses, everything is owned, and also the government of the United States mostly favor the Jewish policies over there, the economic policies over there too. As far as concerned, when I see over there, I don't have time, just with the short time I want to say a few words too. I see the foreign policy of the United States, which is really, really awful too. They need to change it too. When I see in the people of the United States, they are very loving nations, very careful. I see.
Thank you very much. Please.
Thank you, madam.
I am senior attorney in the Supreme Court of Pakistan. First of all, I wish to compliment you and admire the courage, the way you are carrying on the struggle. You are a great fighter, you are a great leader. Don't wish to inflict a speech. I want to ask you a short question. In UK, the inhuman prison conditions prevailed. And if you recall, in the 18th century, there was a play written by John Galsworthy called Justice. When this play was displayed, it created so much a public uproar that even the minister rushed, and there were jail reforms. Now you have civil liberties movement. There are fighters like your good self. I'm your great admirer, the way you plead, and a lot of information you have given to us about the injustice system. I want to know, with all this, the civil liberties movement and other associations and your campaign, what is the public response in the US?
Thank you. My name is Hamid Hassan. I'm a former civil servant. I would like to draw your attention to another aspect of the American, call it justice system or the policies or whatever you like, in contrast to a situation in which hundreds of innocent people are undergoing incarceration without trial, or even with the unjust trial like Dr.Aafia Siddiqui. Here is a system which also protects its criminals, goes out of the way to protect its criminals. And I would give you the example of Raymond Davis, an American, who killed 2 Pakistanis in Lahore in broad daylight. And the American government went out of the way to protect him. Immediately they declared him to be a diplomat, to ask for diplomatic immunity. And they went out of the way in every sense of the word to protect him and to get him back. And unfortunately, the Pakistani government obliged them by releasing him against a loophole, legal loophole, in the form of paying blood money. Although the story goes that even the blood money was not paid by him, it was paid by some other, organizations or institutions within the government of Pakistan. So here is the contrast that you incarcerate innocent people and you protect criminals. I have a small question to Ms. Sara Flounders, and that is, during the course of your following the trial of Dr.Aafia Siddiqui, were you able to dig out the real cause why she was meted out that horrible treatment? What was her fault? Thank you.
I don't think I took very good notes on the second round of questions. I would just say that, yes, the United States has been good to some people. And I would also say that justice is not a building. So you're absolutely right that the United States doesn't have such a good track record in at least finding justice for its criminals. But what I would maintain is that the United States hasn't had a good track record.
Cynthia, his question was that, is there any proposal for jail reforms?
For
reforms? Is there any,
prison.
Any public movement? Any movement or anything for prison reforms? As there
For
was
prison
in,
reform?
Yes, as there was in the UK.
Oh, well, yes, there's a very strong prison reform movement, a restorative justice movement that actually was founded by former Black Panther Party member, now Professor Angela Davis. And her organization is Critical
Resistance.
Critical Resistance, yeah. So yes, there is a movement, but of course, in order to see the kind of change that we need, the movement will have to become more of a mass movement. Even though the name is Critical Resistance, we haven't reached critical mass yet.
I want to pick up on this point about protecting the criminals while criminalizing millions, because it is two sides of the same policy. I mean, our elected officials, by any standard of international law, are war criminals. That's a fact. To wage war on another country that has not attacked you, that's a crime against peace. If you read Nuremberg and Geneva Conventions, any standards of international law, to do anything that impacts on civilian infrastructure is absolutely hands-off. And yet, what was done in Iraq, the infrastructure in Afghanistan was already so laid waste and destroyed. But systematically in Iraq, there was a calculated destruction of water and irrigation, the health system. It was part of the calculation. The first Gulf War, the second. I remember the categories of the NATO war in Yugoslavia. After the war, they had bombed 437 schools, and they had destroyed 14 tanks. Now, that's the calculation. The systematic, intentional destruction of civilian infrastructure. And it comes from the top down. Raymond Davis is not an extraordinary or an exceptional individual. When you use huge contracting firms that are mercenaries, who are told they can kill anyone, and there's no cost. And they're hired by the US government in the thousands. There are more than 130,000 mercenaries now in Afghanistan. So, and I don't know how many in Pakistan, frankly. Many thousands. 65,000 contractors, mercenaries. Huge number. So there's a huge incentive to protect them because they're imposing corporate rule. I want to, though, end on Aafia. What did she do? See, part of the problem with a trial, with the judicial system as it is once you're charged, the common feeling is, well, you must have done something. You must have done something. So what was it you did to deserve this? Something you did. You stepped out of line somewhere. And it's very hard to wrap your head around the injustice of the system that is routinely rounding up in the millions people. It's the same way with the drone attacks. Those people on the ground must have done something. Yeah, they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I think that's very true for Dr.Aafia Siddiqui. Here's a young mother with 3 kids. She must have done something to be kidnapped and incarcerated for 5 years and tortured routinely. And that's now an admitted fact. Denied, couldn't be brought up during her trial. That's something that she had supposedly done, the US could never even admit to, that they had held her for 5 years. So I think we have to sort of break through. That's the weight of an institution. If you're before the US justice system, then they'll sort this out, and a trial will help bring truth to light, and facts will appear, and all this will be made clear. But in truth, you know, that's like Santa Claus. It's not the way the system works. And facts have very little to do with why millions of people in the US are in jail today, or why thousands of people, and all around the world, are the victims of drone attacks. What is that something they're doing? A lot of it has to do with a war machine gone wild, where war is profitable, even when it's massively destructive of the very system it's supposedly protecting. It's dangerous for the planet as a whole. We're here to call for the release of one individual. This is such a contradiction, and yet we really are at the same time indicting the system that would jail a woman so obviously innocent. There was not a bullet. There was not a fingerprint. There was no one injured who even said, I had a scratch, the bullet grazed me. They could not find a place where the wood had splintered from a bullet. And yet, 86 years. So you can't look for rationality in this. But it should impel you to act for Aafia, for Pakistan itself, as we feel compelled to act within the U.S.
Thank you very much. Thank you. On behalf of IPS and on behalf of Dr. Khalid Rahman, I would like to thank everyone for participating in this discussion today. I would like especially to thank the speakers, and I would like to thank Dr. Fowzia Siddiqui for coming here today. Thank you very much. I will ask Mr. Akram Zaki now, Ambassador Akram Zaki, to conclude the session. Thank you very much.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. I think this has been a very special and a very extraordinary session. Two distinguished ladies from the United States of America who are activists for peace and justice have in very eloquent way exposed the injustices that are taking place in the US system. Actually, United States has a declaratory policy and an operational policy.
Yes.
The declarations are for high principles, and operations are for low objectives. People talk of the Cold War period when the former Soviet Union and the United States were engaged in a confrontational posture. There were two centers of power in the USA. There was the White House and the Congress, which elaborated the noble principles. And there was the CIA and the other agencies which carried on the underground activities to counter that. But both operations were continuously going on. With the emergence of George W. Bush Sr., the distinction was abolished. The CIA moved into the White House. And from then onwards, the old principled portions disappeared, and the underground operations became the supreme operations of the United States. And his son, illustrious son, developed it to the ultimate extreme. The same process. His period was the period of illegality, national illegality, international illegality. All the laws of USA were broken, and all the laws that humanity had evolved over the last 2 centuries to tame the war, to talk of humanitarian services, Red Cross and facilities of wounded and sick, and rights of prisoners of war, they were all forgotten. Now, the struggle between justice and injustice, a struggle between tyranny and freedom has been going on throughout the human history. And the one thing that is common, the human spirit has never accepted tyranny. There is always been resistance to injustice, which you spoke about, that the hope is that this resistance to injustice is to be kept alive. And it has to be expanded in a manner when it becomes sufficient in strength to overwhelm injustice. Whenever somebody raised a voice for justice, he had to pay through suffering and even sometimes through his life. The Roman injustice crucified Jesus Christ. The tyranny of Yazid executed Imam Hussein. In Christianity, we have martyrs. In Islam, we have martyrs. You have talked of the civil rights movement, where Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., and in '68, Bobby Kennedy, John had gone earlier. They spoke for certain principles, and they had to pay for their life. No wonder that even in our own country, in '68, there was a movement, as I referred, against prolonged military rule. And ultimately, the man who led that had to pay for with his life. This time we have been lucky. The Musharraf era, which was coextensive with the era of tyranny of George W. Bush, we had this Bush-Mush period of illegality. He was removed through a political process because through a long duration, enough mobilization that can take place amongst the people that, and this started in March 2007 when he tried to remove the Chief Justice. This was the defiance by the Chief Justice, the resistance put up by the Chief Justice to that particular act of tyranny, mobilized all the pent-up feelings, and the civil society, the media, the lawyers led the vanguard movement, and he had ultimately to quit. And now he cannot even enter the country. Because, as Jefferson once said, the tree of liberty must be nurtured from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. To nurture the tree of liberty, it is not only the blood of patriots, sometimes it is also necessary to have the blood of the tyrants. So the tyrants have to run away because they don't have the courage of their convictions, so they prefer to run away and live in disgrace rather than go to the gallows like those who believe. Madam, you have said something about Stockwell's book, In Search of Enemies. There is much literature on this subject, and some people have analyzed that United States, the empire, has always been in search of enemies. Perhaps because the origin of settlement in the New World was with the genocide of the Aborigines. And then westward expansion was carried out by shooting first and talking later. So there are 3 or 4 elements which are dominant in understanding the United States' current approach. 1, self-righteousness. I am right and you are wrong, irrespective of what I do. 2nd, frontier psychology. I shoot first and ask questions later. 3rd, disposable consumer society. Use it and throw it away. And 4th, stock market. Nothing has permanent value. Everything is changing. So this is a society, forgive my saying so, which has moved from barbarism to decadence without the intervening phase of civilization.
That's right.
Now, you have talked about the role of CIA and FBI in the 60s and 70s, but this has become a child's play as compared to the new laws that have been passed since 9/11. The Patriot Act, the Defense Act that you referred to, and the establishment of Homeland Security marathon monster. 250,000 people are working in the headquarters of the National Homeland Security Organization. And they are building a structure which is 3 to 4 times bigger than Pentagon. They have permeated every sphere of US life, and some right-thinking American has recently written, very soon the American citizens will be hoping that they have at least as much freedom as our North Korean citizens have, because their situation is becoming worse than that. It is in this situation that Aafia Siddiqui is one of the victims, along with 3.2 million others and 7.5 million still others who are in various jails, which are a source of profit like the war. So coming back to the creation, looking for enemies, when the Soviet Union disappeared, they immediately looked for new enemies. And the two of the enemies they identified is rising China and the Muslim world. So the objectives was, you have yourself said that in the prisons today in the United States, majority are colored and Muslims. So they have new enemies. Previously, killing a communist was a noble act. Now killing a Muslim is a noble act. And therefore drone attacks all over the Muslim world. And one reason for the drone attack is that bullies are cowards. Every bully is a coward. They don't want to die, but they want to kill everybody else. And drone is the instrument in which there is no risk of their own person dying because it's not being flown by any human being. So now the main instrument of CIA's operations in various parts of the world is going to be increasing use of drones. And this will go on till a number of other countries make drones with the capability of flying them over the United States. Till then, they will not stop. You have identified that a certain section of the United States is really the victim while the others are the beneficiaries. And this has become clear after the present election, 2012, that the United Nations, that the USA is gradually moving to be DSA, Divided States of America.
Thanks for that.
At least the beginning has been made from Louisiana and a few other states who are making petitions to get out of the rut. I don't know whether the Homeland Security will let them do it. And Homeland Security is going to keep them there. Maybe more of the Louisiana people and more of California people will now be in those prisons which they are building in for the future. But as long as there are people who are raising their voice and resisting injustice and tyranny, and when they multiply, and they will multiply because all the privileges given, social benefits, education benefits, non-employment benefits which are being withdrawn, more and more people will become aware of the need to resist injustice.